Welcome to the podcast. My name is Father Bill W. I'm an Episcopal priest and I live here in Austin, Texas. Purpose of these podcasts is to try to go a little bit deeper into the spirituality, the history, and the psychology that underlie the 12-step recovery journey. I've been at this thing for a pretty long time, had some good teachers along the way, and just trying to pass on to folks some of the stuff that has been very freely given to me. So encourage you to go and visit our website. It's entitled Two-Way Prayer, and there you will find kind of a nice video on the homepage. It'll kind of lead you through the process, teach you what you need to know, and I'd encourage you to start doing it. It's the kind of prayer and meditation that they did in the early days of AA. Somehow it got lost, and I'm doing my best to try to bring it back. And people really responded to it. I mean, I get emails all the time from people telling me how transformational it is, just really zips up their program to a new level. And that's certainly what it did for me. Sign up there when you're there for the newsletter. Just sent one out, and usually some pretty interesting material there. So go for it and join us on this journey. Also remind you that we're now putting these onto YouTube. So if you have access to that, go ahead and take a look. It's under the title Two-Way Prayer. Okay, enough business. We're starting a new series now, and it is titled Spiritual Evolution. And that is also the title of a book by Dr. George Vaillant, Spiritual Evolution, a Scientific Defense of Faith. Vaillant's an interesting character. For many years, he was a research psychiatrist at Harvard University, and he also had the distinction of serving as one of the non-alcoholic trustees for Alcoholics Anonymous. He's one of the few numbers of scientists who really understand, I think, what 12-step recovery is about, understands how it works, and understands why it works. He's got some other books. He kind of specialized in addiction studies as well. So I'll put a link to his book in the show notes. I would encourage you to get a copy. I'll link you to the kind of the used bookstore that I use oftentimes, and get a pretty good bargain on those. It's worth having in your library. I found it to be one of the most interesting books I've come across in a long while. The book does contain some scientific language. He references a number of studies. George is an academic. He knows his stuff. But while the first few chapters might seem a little bit heavy with brain chemistry and a little bit of that stuff, don't stumble over that. Get through that part quickly and try to reach the broader concepts. I think it's really an important book for understanding what spirituality is really all about. And he would say spirituality isn't just a nice thing to have, but it really is the heart and soul of that psychic change that Carl Jung talked about, that's mentioned in the big book, that is the goal of the 12-step process. It's to have a spiritual awakening and experience. This book will help you understand, or it certainly did for me, more completely what that means. So let's dive in. And appropriately, chapter 1 starts off with a prayer. And it's a prayer that's attributed to St. Francis. He didn't write it, but he kind of lived it. And it's the sample prayer that Bill Wilson uses in the 12 and 12 when he's writing on the 11th step. Most of you probably know it. And the emotional states that Francis is seeking to find in his prayer, they're actually some of the same ones that Vaillant breaks down and studies in depth. So they serve as a nice introduction to Vaillant's understanding of the real meaning of spirituality. So Francis prays, where there's hatred, let me so love. Where there's injury, pardon or forgiveness. Where there's doubt, faith. Where there's despair, hope. Where there's sadness, joy. And he's talking about emotions here. He's talking about the state of my mind and heart, my consciousness. And I think most of us come in here filled with what? With hatred, full of injury, full of doubt, full of despair, sadness. We've lost so many things and people in our lives, and we start the journey. And the journey is exactly that. It's moving from this state of negative emotions to what researchers call the positive emotions. And that's how he's going to define spirituality. So we'll get to that in just a minute. So I think that's really the goal of the 12 steps, shifting from this one state to another. And Vaillant says that there's an individual evolution that can happen to us over the course of time. I'm 51 years sober. I'm not the same person I was when I came in, filled with what? Fear, hatred, doubt, despair, sadness, all of that stuff. There's been a shift. Well, spirituality is what Vaillant's going to say is that inner shift that happens at the level of consciousness. So it doesn't come overnight, but it does come over time. So the expression keep coming back, you're not going to usually get it on the first, I didn't get it on my first try in AA. And I certainly didn't get it in my first several meetings when I came back for my second try. But gradually, slowly, in an evolutionary kind of way, things start to shift deep inside. Where? At the level of the unconscious mind. Convinced of that. Vaillant brings something else to the table. For 35 years, he was in charge of a very special study at Harvard University, and it was called the Study of Adult Development. I put a link to it in the show notes. And what it did was it followed some 268 Harvard-educated men, the majority of whom were members of the undergraduate classes of 42, 1943, and 1944. And it tracked them and studied their lives for 70 years. This was a 70-year study. Some scientific studies, 6 months, a year, 2 or 3 years, 5 years is exceptional. And yet what we know is the longer you study something, the better you're going to really experience what are the outcomes. You're going to get a very limited picture in the beginning. And Vaillant headed this project up for 35 years. It also, simultaneously, they ran a study of inner city kids in the Boston area, some 456 of them, interviewed them at 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 60 years, and what sort of changes did they go through? Vaillant says, he watched teenagers mature into great-grandparents, adolescent caterpillars evolve into great-grandfather butterflies. You stick around in the program long enough, you get to see that. I get to see people at 10 years, 15 years, 20 years sober that I knew when they first came in. They're not the same people, They've undergone an evolution. And that's what spirituality, according to Vaillant, is really all about, shifting to a positive inner state. Some of the things that he learned was how unimportant were social class, religious denomination, even IQs were to human development. What was important, they discovered, was emotional intelligence, maturing spiritually, developing spirituality, growing these positive emotions. We talk about the gift of desperation. Someone comes in, they've just been through a treatment center, they've got a great education, they've got many, many things to get sober for, and they blow it. Why? You can say they're not ready. I don't know if that's true. They're not growing. They're not changing. You take the man or the woman who comes in desperate, who has lost it all. Some of those are your best candidates for making it. Got all sorts of things going against them. I got a friend bombed out of the Salvation Army and got him in a hotel. You know, he's got 5 or 6 years sober now, and he's a beautiful, beautiful guy. And he's you just see him changing and growing and evolving. That's the key word that Vaillant wants to bring to the table. So psychologists tend to focus on the negative emotions, on anger, depression, anxiety, and those things are real, and we need help with them. But what Vaillant learned is that they reside in a different part of the brain than do the positive emotions. And they serve one purpose, but the positive emotions serve a very different purpose. And we don't study the positive emotions nearly as much as we really need to. So let's take a look at the definition of spirituality that Vaillant uses in his book. I found this really helpful because spirituality can be kind of a vague, amorphous, nebulous. What the hell is it? Spiritual. What does it mean? And he says this. This is his definition. He says spirituality is an amalgam, and that means a mixture. It's a mixture of the positive emotions that do two things. One is bind us to human beings, and the second is binds us to our experience of God as we may understand Him. We come into this program isolated, cut off, disconnected. And that was the definition I've always used for spirituality. It's the connecting, the linkage between myself and others, between myself and God, between myself and my true self. That's spirituality. You know, I'm so much more comfortable with may the force be with you. Is the force operating with you, within you? Is it flowing through you? You know, that's spirituality. It's connectedness. And in some ways, the more disconnected we are, the more appreciative we are of what connection feels like. I love Bill Wilson's description. He said when Ebby came to see him on that first visit, he said it was like I was chained to the back of a cave. And Lois and my family and his doctor were out there saying, "Come out, Bill, come out." And he couldn't. But Ebby could lead him out. He connected with him at a very deep level. And I think that's an important thing that happens to us in recovery. We begin to connect with people. We're distrustful when we start, but maybe I can trust this group, these people. I remember saying to my sponsor, he would invite me over to dinner to his house and do nice things for me. "Why are you doing this for me?" And his answer, I couldn't fight. He said, "Because somebody did it to me. And I'm passing on to you what I got from them." There's something in the human soul that responds to that. This is the real thing. I've been looking for the real thing. I've been wanting to respond to the real thing, and I haven't been able to. That's spirituality. And binding us to an experience of God, he says. Not an idea of God, not a thought of God. This is important, but an experience of God. And I think that perhaps is why two-way prayer can be so very impactful for people. It isn't just praying off into the universe. It's waiting around long enough to hear what's coming back. And it's only if I'm in relationship can I respond to God with love. If I'm just meeting God in a vacuum, I don't know how I can love that. But I can feel the love, and then I can begin to respond with love. And that's spiritual transformation. He lists the positive emotions that he's going to study in the book, and those are the best chapters. We're going to spend a couple of chapters, episodes here, kind of laying the groundwork, but I can't wait to get to the chapters because that's where it's at. And what are they? A chapter on love, a chapter on hope. We don't have any hope when we come in here, maybe a tiny bit. And that's what's going to grow. Joy, forgiveness, compassion, faith, not a set of beliefs, but the power of faith. And then the two final ones, awe, A-W-E, awe, a sense of wonder. and then gratitude. So these are the ones he's going to study. He's going to look at them somewhat scientifically, do some studies on them, quote some studies on them. But we're going to learn some stuff from this. So I think you're going to find it interesting. One thing he points out early in these emotions is look at them. They are not all about me. Love is not all about me. Hope is not all about me. Joy, I mean, when the book says the problem is self, it's right on. And when the first word of the 12 steps is we, I think we're starting to get introduced to what this concept is. He has a nice quote. He says, the positive emotions have the potential to free the self from the self. To free the self from the self. Robert Johnson, talks about suicide. A lot of us come in here kind of feeling suicidal, and I want to kill myself. Well, which self do you want to kill? You want to kill the self that's stuck in the old crap, but there's another self, and it's in another part of our brain, scientifically, that we need to get in touch with. And that's one of the reasons that struck me when I first stumbled onto the Oxford Group stuff 31 years ago, was the real importance of prayer and meditation. They said it was more important than going to meetings. Blew my mind. Never heard that. It sounded like a heresy. More important than meetings. Why? Because that's where I'm going to go into the unconscious mind through prayer and meditation and link up with this power that is waiting to speak to me. So do the two-way prayer. This connecting, it's the small ego self with the greater self. Jung called it the greater personality. Big Book calls it what? The reality within. Oxford Group called it the beyond that is within. Gives an example in looking at these positive and negative emotions. Makes an important point that he's going to develop later. He says, take two emotions, vengeance and forgiveness. He says the long-term results of these two emotions are very different. Negative emotions, Vaillant says, can be critical for survival. Anger, terror, these can trigger a reaction in me that can be helpful, but they're all about right now. They're emotional states that relate to a threat, a condition that is happening now. I'm terrified. And they may have kept me alive back then. But if they're still operating now at the same level of intensity, we're talking about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We're having flashbacks, and many of us grew up in emotionally troubled homes. I certainly did. There was a lot of anger, rage happening, drunkenness going on, stuff getting broken. It was a terrifying place to be a kid, and negative emotions can get in my brain and stick there, and I get a flashback to some of that stuff. Well, this is where nurturing the positive emotions, moving towards those, learning forgiveness, letting go is what spiritual recovery is really all about. He writes, careful experiments document that while negative emotions narrow attention and miss the forest through the trees, positive emotions, especially joy, make thought patterns that are more flexible, creative, integrative, I guess, that might be a better way to pronounce that, and efficient. Step 10, when you're wrong, promptly admit it. All right? And efficient. It works better. All right? So this is moving into that fourth dimension of existence. And this is important, So what I like about Vaillant's approach, he's not talking about having a spiritual experience, meaning I'm up in the clouds like Bill Wilson was in Detox. I'm standing on the clouds at the top of a mountain, God's present, wind's blowing. Well, give me one of those. He says, that's not where it's at. That's not spirituality. Maybe a hot flash, as Wilson called it, a white light experience. But does it really change you? I mean, you got to come down from the mountaintop. And then you got to stay with the program and really begin to grow and to change and to shift from living in one part of the brain, as we're going to get into next week, to a very different part of the brain. When we're frightened, angry, depressed, it's hard to be creative or to learn new things. It's stuckness. We get stuck in ourselves, stuck in a part of our brain that's meant to help us survive for the moment. But it's not the part of the brain that is designed to lead us into the future. So what Vaillant weaves throughout the book is how AA and the 12-step fellowships and the steps and the program, how they take all of this into account and help nurture spiritual change. I don't know that when they wrote the big book, they were cognizant of this sort of stuff. But scientists who are studying it, like Harry Tiebout, we did a series on him. Why is this thing working when so many other things don't seem to work? Now, it's not that I do this, to the exclusion of some of those other things. Some of the studies that have been most scientifically accurate, let's say, the Project Match study in the 90s, I guess it was, came out and said, if you're doing 12-step and you're getting some good counseling, the results are going to be even better. So it's not this way versus that way. It's doing the things that are going to lead to change. When Vaillant was a professor at Harvard, he was also the coordinator of a detox center that Harvard was operating. And he says that as a condition of his employment, for 10 years, he had to attend an open AA meeting once every month. And he was amazed at what he saw happening there. He said he found more spirituality there than he found in his church. He found more healing going on there than he was experiencing through his relations with his fellow psychiatrists at some of their organizational meetings. In my early years as a counselor, I was in Detroit, and Catholic priests would go to guest house not far from Detroit. And there was a 17, 18-week program that they went through. And for the last 2 weeks, they had to come down to the treatment center where I was at. And it was kind of a rough bunch that we were housed with there. And some of the priests would take to it like ducks to water. Those were the ones in whom spirituality was happening. And some of them were just terrified by what they saw. They'd go through the motions, but they were not present. They were not connecting. They were not linking up. They were the religious ones versus the spiritual ones. They were the holy ones versus the whole ones. They didn't get it. They just didn't get it. I also had an experience later on. I was at a treatment center out in Arizona, and I was director there, and I took the psychiatrist who was working with the patients. I took her to her first AA meeting. She'd never been to one. She left that meeting in tears. It was amazing. I've never seen anything like that. They touched her. What you get told in most of your clinical stuff, don't touch these people. Well, you don't touch them, they can't touch you. And alcoholism and addiction are illnesses of disconnection. And recovery is sending little tentacles out. You send yours out to me, I send mine out to you, and we link up in a good way. In a good way. And we feel the power. The power of what? The power of love, power of hope, the power of joy, starting to light up inside of us. We can feel it. We can sense it. So he closes the book, or this chapter rather, with three major points that he wants to develop. I'll go over them briefly, and then we'll touch on some of them as we go forward in the series. The first is that spirituality resides in what is called the mammalian or the emotional brain. All right? It isn't rooted in ideas, in sacred texts, or in theology. Rather, spirituality comprises the positive emotions and social connection. Love, he says, is the shortest definition of spirituality I know. An addiction, I'm firmly convinced, is a love disorder. It's a blockage in the flow of love between myself and you, between myself and God, God and me. There's a lack of flow. That's spirituality. That's the state of my spiritual life. Am I connected? Is it flowing? Or am I free me from the bondage of self? Am I living in bondage? And the fact is, I'm convinced this is not a one-time deal, guys. Not a one-time deal. It's a spiral. You're going to go back to prison over and over again. I certainly have in my 51 years in recovery, where I'm going to pull away from God, pull away from you, pull away from my true self. My ego is going to take control, and the linkage, the connection is gonna start to constrict. And I feel it, and I feel it, and I feel it. All right. Spirituality and love, he says, result in certain attitudes, feelings that go respect, appreciation, acceptance, empathy, compassion, involvement, tenderness, and gratitude. I used to hate gratitude. We're going to have a gratitude meeting. I remember the first year, oh my God, gratitude. I hate these things. Let's talk about depression. Talk about something I know, gratitude, I can handle it now. Tenderness. This is where it starts to really come alive, or it doesn't. Some people in recovery can be very crispy, very brittle, very angry. What? They haven't grown emotionally and spiritually. It's the heart that has to get changed, not the head. There's a part for the head, but that's not where it's going to happen. So we'll take a brief look in next episode at the mammalian brain versus the lizard brain. And alcoholism and addiction, they're happening in both parts. And one part has to be developed, and you got to be aware of the other, but know where you are, know when your lizard is going, and when your mammalian brain is operating. You can call it left brain, right brain, to keep it simple. I know when I'm in prayer and meditation, things are okay. Things are okay. And I can actually sense that I'm shifting. When I do my two-way prayer in the morning, I can feel a shift going on from the left brain to the right brain. Take a few breaths. I'm coming from my left brain. It just helped me get my coffee, and it was very effective for doing that, paying your taxes, driving to work, left brain stuff, nice and helpful. Right brain, peace, joy, love, connectedness. Very different. Very different. And it isn't one or the other. It's the balance between the two. Right? So that's the first thing he wants to bring out in the book. Second thing, that spirituality reflects humanity's biological press for connection and community building, as much as it reflects the individual's need for sacred revelation. Spirituality is more about us than it is about me. He says a couple of quotes here I want to a tribute to him. He says, thus I would suggest that our spirituality is made manifest not as much by our inner enlightenment and our prayers as by our outward behavior. All right? He says, for example, Jesus Christ and Karl Marx are not usually paired together, but both men were revolutionaries who mistrusted organized religion. Why? Because religion talked about without actually creating loving communities. And this is one of the things that I was kind of taught. I had some pretty good teachers, particularly in the beginning, and they taught me that this was a radical program, revolutionary. And when I started studying Frank Bookman, he was described as a revolutionary. Jesus was described as a revolutionary, not a reformer. A reformer wants to kind of come along and clean up the edges a bit. But I don't find reforming works very effectively with addiction. It takes a radical approach. God is everything or God is nothing. And I'm sad to say, oftentimes in my life, God is in the nothing category, and I've got to face that, admit that, own that, and then shift from that. And it's a back and a forth. It's a spiral. It's a spiral, but it's a spiral that's leading. And that's what evolution, when he talks about evolution, it isn't like, boom, flash, you're going to move from a dinosaur to a chicken. That happens over long, long periods of time. And the same thing is happening inside of us. Transformation is happening, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. I'm much more comfortable with the slow. I trust the slow a hell of a lot more. I like the long-term studies. I want to see you in 5 years, 10 years. You're still doing your prayer. You're still working with people. You're still changing. Thomas Merton said, if after 5 years I'm still praying to the same God I was 5 years ago, something's wrong. It has to be evolving, going deeper. More and more is being revealed. That's the course of real transformation. So I think this is a radical program. And one of my sponsors said, a lot of pieces, most people you're going to meet in 12-step will be people who have had a limited conversion. And they've settled for it. Most people you meet in church, limited conversion. But there are people you're going to meet in church and in the program who've had much more than a limited conversion. They've had transformations. They've had psychic changes. And they're revolutionary in their approach to the program and to life and to God. Those people attract me. He notes the Buddhist ideal is that of the bodhisattva. And that is a person who has done his or her work, but who chooses to stay in the world. Why? To help other people. I don't want to get to heaven. I'd rather stay here and help you get to heaven. That's what they're saying, rather than going directly to nirvana. I'm going to stay behind and lend a hand, people leave their 12-step fellowships after 5, 10, 15, 30 years. Why? You should be still involved in some ways, bringing that message. I hope I'm bringing something to the table in terms of trying to go a little bit deeper with some of this literature and some of these ideas to help people who maybe been at this thing for a long time and still really need to grow, and or people who've been in AA or OA or NA or CA before, and it was just very regimental, very mechanical. I want to tell them there's something really different here. And that's spiritual growth and spiritual transformation. That's a journey that's exciting. And if recovery isn't exciting, the hell with it. Got to be more than just not drinking, drugging, or eating compulsively. There's got to be joy and happiness. So, service. Vaillant's third point. He says our brains are hardwired to generate positive emotions, that humanity's task is to pay attention to them, for they are the source of our spiritual being and the key to our cultural evolutionary progress. We're growing individually, we're also growing culturally with a few setbacks, as we're seeing right now along the way. All right. And we're evolving physically as parts of our brains are expanding and growing, and further developing. So three ways of growing: individually, culturally, and physically. We'll dive into that a little bit more next time. Okay? And he says the faith traditions have really been here to support that, push that, move that. You got to be pretty careful and selective in them, because there's a lot of fundamentalism out there, religious boot camp stuff that may be helpful in the beginning, but as Richard Rohr has said, I think quite perceptively, it's a wonderful way to begin. It's a terrible way to end. And I've seen people 30, 40, 50 years in recovery. Do I want what they have? Not on your life. If that's it, no thank you. I'm going another route. I want to stay sober. But you gotta be people who are growing and changing. They're out there. They're out there. You got to find them, and you got to become one. It doesn't mean you're there and it's over. Again, always going on. He says only by noting the long-term consequences of the competing faith traditions, the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, the Islamic tradition, the Buddhist tradition, can we separate evolutionary truth from scriptural superstition. And that's where the fundamentalism comes in. I've got the truth and you don't. Bill Wilson was really clear. AA ain't the only way to get sober. It is a way. Might even be the better way. What you got to decide is it your way? And then if it is your way, go in 100%. This thing ain't like joining the Rotary Club or joining the YMCA or something like this. This is a life-changing deal. Approach it that way, and you're going to feel the difference. Okay, let me finish up here. He says we need to bring our positive emotions to conscious attention, and we need not disdain to study them with our science. That's an important one too. That science has something to offer. It's not science and or, or rather science or. Science needs to come to the table. It has something to offer. Study. That was Harry Tiebout. Why is this thing working? He I had a psychologist friend who kind of went through a similar thing. He says, I started studying AA because either I was the damned worst psychologist in his case, or they know something that I don't know. What is it? Go find out. He finishes the chapter, and I'll finish this podcast with this. He says, if my purpose as an author can be oversimplified into a single wish, it would be this: to restore our faith in spirituality as an essential human striving. Having had, Wilson wanted to change it back to a spiritual experience. He said spiritual awakening can be rather tepid, but to get into the water, you know what I mean? To swim in the spirit. All right, that's where it's at. I think you're going to enjoy this book, but we will try to get through the heavy part pretty quickly, and then dive into the different chapters on joy, on love, on faith, trust. There's some really, really good stuff there, and George is a good teacher. So I think that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was helpful. Hope you'll get the book. If you want to shoot me a question or something, don't put it in the notes, because I never tend to read those on the podcast deal, but you can write me at twowayprayer@gmail.com. So love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. God bless, and keep coming back.